Hi. In this lecture, we're going to step back a little bit, and we're going to think about how do we model people. Because a lot of models that are going to be concerning us are models of people and groups of people, like firms and governments and organizations. So if we want to write good models of those things, then we've got to have good models of the parts, good models of the people. Okay. Modeling people is tricky. The physicist Murray Gell-Mann once famously said, "Imagine how difficult physics would be if electrons could think." So what did he mean by that? What he meant was that if you take an electron or a carbon atom or even a water molecule, it doesn't think. It doesn't try and make sense of the world. It doesn't have any goals or objectives or anything like that, no beliefs. And so it's pretty straightforward to model how those things function. When you look at people, people are much more complicated, right? We're purposeful. We've got goals, we've got objectives, we've got things we want to do, we've got ways of seeing the world, we've got belief structures. We're messy. And because of that, you just don't quite know how we're going to behave. Now, on top of that, we're diverse, right? We want different things. We have different goals and objectives. So this combination of sort of purposeful thinking actors who are different means that it can be really hard to understand what they do and how they act. So how do we do it? Well, we're going to talk about three basic frameworks. The first framework is called the rational actor model. Now, in this framework, what you do is you assume that people optimize. Now, this is unrealistic, and I'll talk about this in the next lecture in some detail, but it's a good benchmark. So one way to think about it is just to assume, let's just assume people have some sort of goal and they optimize their goal. Okay? Second thing, we can assume what we call a behavioral model. Now, here what you do is you sort of gather up all sorts of data about how real people actually do make decisions and choices and act. And then what you try and do is model people as close as possible to how real people behave. Now, of course, you can't make it too complicated, but you sort of try and include the one or two different things from perfect rationality, right, the biases that people might have. All right, and then the third thing we'll look at is even simpler, which are sort of rule-based models. So here what we're going to do is instead of really digging deep into psychology, we're just going to assume that people follow rules and then see how those things add up. Now what we're going to see is in some cases, which of these three things we assume matters a lot, and in other cases, which of these three things we assume doesn't matter very much at all. And so how we model people and whether it's really important that we get it exactly right is going to be a function of the particular model we're playing with. And we'll look at that a little bit later on in this unit. Okay, but first let me just give a little bit more background. So how does a rational actor model work? In a rational actor model, you assume that there's an objective function. There's literally a mathematical function that someone's trying to maximize, right? So that could be, if you're a person, maximizing happiness or utility. If you're a firm, it could be maximizing profits or market share. Or if you're a government, if you're running for office, it could be maximizing the number of votes. Then what you assume is that people optimize. Given your objective, what you do is you do the optimal thing. So you take the choice that makes you as happy as possible, you make the political decision that gets you the most votes, and you produce the product that makes you the most money. Let me be more specific. So suppose you're an economist and you sit down and think, how many hours should someone choose to work? Well, what you do is you'd write down a function, a utility function. You say the utility depends on consumption and on leisure. And you might assume this like this one, it's the square root of consumption times the square root of leisure. Now, why would you assume that? Well, the square root function, right, starts out up and then sort of slowly falls off. So that means the first bit of consumption is really good, but then it becomes worth less. And the first bit of leisure is really good, right? The first hour of vacation is great, but by a week you're sort of ready to get back to work. So that also falls off. They've got what they call diminishing returns. So this function sort of says consumption is good, but it becomes less good the more you have. Leisure is good, but it becomes less good the more you have. Well, this is your function, and then what you do is you just choose consumption and leisure, depending on how much they cost, to maximize that. Now, that may not be exactly what you do. You might not be sitting at home writing down functions and solving these equations about what to do, but economists sort of assume that you do that. It's as if you do that, right? That you come close enough to doing that this is a worthwhile model. Now, the rational actor models come under a lot of criticism, and particularly of late, according to just basic data, right? And so there's a movement within economics called the behavioral revolution, but this has also been going on in psychology for about 100 years. Namely, that is you should actually, instead of assuming people are rational, you should just go out and look and see what people do. And if you observe what people do, you'll find out that they're not rational, and they're not rational in systematic ways. Recently, this whole research paradigm has been really propped up through evidence from neuroscience, right? So you can actually look at the structure of the brain, look at how people think in particular situations, and you can see, in fact, why they're thinking in ways that the rational actor model would consider to be irrational. So those are sort of two benchmarks. On the one hand, you can assume people are rational. On the other hand, you can assume that, well, people sort of do what people do. Now, this other thing, this people doing what people do, is going to be a lot messier. So therefore, there's a third way. And the third approach comes from, again, social scientists, but also from some computer scientists and even some psychologists. And that is to assume that people follow rules. So remember our Schelling model. Right? We didn't have a very elaborate model of how people behaved there. All we did was we just assumed that people moved out of the neighborhood if the neighborhood became too much unlike them. So this is just a simple rule. And if that simple rule is close to what people do, that may be sufficient to work in the model. Okay, so what do we got? We got these three basic frameworks. People optimize, people are sort of behavioral, they do what people do, and people follow rules. Each of those in a given situation will give us sort of slightly different predictions about how people behave. Right? And when we start aggregating them and having them interact, we could get very different conclusions. But then there are the other cases where we really don't see that much of a difference depending on what we assume. But what we want to do now, in these next couple of lectures, is we just want to sort of think through the logic of what a rational actor model means. Visit some of the biases that we've seen, or that psychologists have seen when they look at how people actually behave, and then think through sort of what a rule-based model might look like. And we'll conclude by sort of comparing all these in a couple of settings and see when it doesn't matter and when it really does matter. Okay, thank you.